Hello, and welcome to another episode of AppSec Decoded. I'm Taylor Armerding, Security Advocate for the Synopsys Software Integrity Group, and today we're going to be talking about holistic AppSec. AppSec is now mainstream, which is a very good thing. It means that security testing is an embedded part of the software development lifecycle. And automated security testing tools have become faster and more sophisticated, so they're less likely to overwhelm developers with too many trivial findings or false positives, or to slow them down. But as good and necessary as AppSec testing tools are, it's not nearly enough simply to buy them and run them. You need to buy the right ones. You need to configure them so that they help build security into your SDLC without bogging it down. You need a security strategy and a plan. And you need developers with the skills to build trust into your software. It's called Holistic AppSec. Chai Bhatt, Security Solutions Manager with the Synopsys Software Integrity Group, is on the front line of that initiative. And so Chai, thank you very much for joining us here. Let's start with the basics. What do you mean by holistic AppSec, and why is it that important?
Thank you, Taylor. Before I get into that, let me talk a little bit about the history of application security, or AppSec.
Yep.
As a history enthusiast myself, when you look at like the late 90s or 1999, 2000, there was no application security testing in the SDLC at all.
Right.
It was more often that, hey, you wrote code, you pushed out the app, and that whatever little testing was done was in the production.
Right.
Things began to change a little bit. SAST, static testing, was introduced 17 years ago, I believe.
Right. Okay.
And then people started testing the source code.
Yeah.
And they were calling it shift left because they were moving the testing to the left of
Beginning
the SDLC.
of the life cycle. Yes.
Exactly. So, and that's how it started.
Yep.
With SAST, checking the code as it was after it was written, and people discovered that by shifting left in the SDLC, you were actually saving a lot of time and money by not having to make changes later on in the SDLC, which were much more expensive and time intensive. So after that, gradually, the application development started changing as well. So back then, applications were relatively straightforward. But after that, nowadays especially, we're increasingly more reliant on open source. And some applications are 90 to 100% even open source components in there.
Right.
Another thing is that's different now than, say, 17 years ago was that we're also deploying a lot of these applications in the public or the private or a hybrid cloud. So these applications are being deployed.
Yeah.
So because of this, vulnerabilities are being introduced into the software development lifecycle in practically every stage. So, as you're not just as you're writing code, but as you're bringing in open source components, as you're maybe writing configuration files, as you're, containerizing your applications to deploy them in the cloud. So vulnerabilities are being introduced all over your application lifecycle. So really, what that necessitates is testing across the SDLC. So in addition to SAST, which was used 17 years ago, you're also using SCA for open source, detecting open source vulnerabilities. You're using DAST, IAST, and you're also doing some pen testing before you actually deploy the application in the cloud. And you're also checking the configuration files for the cloud, the container images, and so on. So it's really essentially testing across the SDLC, or what we're calling is shifting everywhere.
Everywhere. Yeah, that is definitely a buzzword. Can you elaborate a bit more on what shift everywhere means?
Absolutely. So basically, shifting everywhere means it's performing the right application security testing at the right time, as soon as the artifact for that testing is available.
Yeah.
So the artifact could be, code. It could be configuration files. It could be scripts. It could be APIs. It could be, container images. It could be any amount of things, right? So as soon as that artifact is available and there's enough of that artifact, you're doing you're testing at the right depth and the right breadth as fast as possible. So that's really shifting everywhere. And you don't really necessarily have to test in depth. You can do intelligent testing where you can say, hey, you only just got in some open source components and you're just doing SCA because you integrated some open source libraries into your code or something.
Yeah.
Or say you just wrote some proprietary code and then you just want to do some SAST. So you can do intelligent testing. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing everything, but you're doing testing intelligently all across the SDLC.
What needs to be done when it needs to be done.
Exactly, the right depth and the right breadth.
Right. Okay. Right, because it does seem like one of the things that I hear constantly at security conferences is make it easy, make security the easy way. They keep talking about that. Obviously, development teams, understandably, don't want to be overwhelmed with trivial or false positives, and so that means, as you were saying, your testing tools need to be doing the testing at the right time, right place, whatever. So, how does the security team address that? How does it happen that you don't make your developers tune it out?
Yeah, that's a great question, and if you look at if you think about it from a DevOps perspective, as a DevOps engineer, as a developer, my job is to push code out, push new differentiating features out as fast and as frequently as possible.
Yeah.
So anything that's hindering that is causing friction in the SDLC, and typically, a developer does not want any friction in the SDLC.
Right.
You want to use automated testing within the SDLC, that tests that run fast, and you're doing the right scan at the right time, at the right depth, so you're introducing as less friction as possible. What's interesting is we talk about automated testing, but not everything can be detected by automated testing.
Okay.
So for example, there's vulnerabilities which we can detect by automated testing, but then there's design flaws.
Yeah.
And those typically get introduced earlier in the SDLC when you're in the planning phase and the design phase. And these design flaws, no matter what testing tool you have, you cannot detect design flaws with any kind of automated testing at all. So you have to have some kind of, maybe do some threat modeling, do architecture review to discover what these flaws are and fix them before it even gets to automated testing. And then there's other things like, we just recently did a study, and it showed that a lot of the vulnerabilities that we discovered in our testing were related to security controls. And if you look at it from an automated testing perspective, basically the automated test will see if there's a security control in place, and it'll say, okay, there's a security control in place, good enough. But the automated testing won't go and look to see if the security control is broken or if it's not configured correctly.
Correct.
And then you're missing out. So you need manual testing to do that. So, so it's almost like you need manual testing at critical points of the SDLC, and even pen testing, which is expert-led pen testing, right before you deploy the application.
Right. That it sounds like there's a lot for CISOs to do, Chief Information Security Officers. So how can a CISO measure, report, and improve an organization's InfoSec risk posture, would you say?
Great question, Taylor. So as Peter Drucker said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it.
Right.
So really the first step is to understand where you are and measure what you're doing, and is that enough in terms of what you're doing for your software security program. And for example, the BSIM, which is pronounced BSIM, it's a Building Security and Maturity Model, is a great study of real-world software security programs that is organized in a way that will help you understand how your program is structured, what activities you're doing, what your peers in the industry, what are some of the activities that they're doing, and how your program compares to other programs in your peer group, for example. So, and the best part about BSIM is it's a data-based initiative. BSIM, the study is done every year. and we actually quantify hundreds of software security programs across various industries and verticals, and we published a study based on real data that we get from these programs. And this is almost like a measuring stick.
Sure.
You can compare your own program to others' programs and see how it stands and where you need to be and what you need to do to get there.
Right, sure. So last question. Let's say that you are a director of AppSec with a small team with limited skills and limited resources, and we're trying to do the right thing. What advice do you have for us?
It's almost like a two-part answer, right?
Okay.
So one is you have to have the right team in place. So you have to have the right skills in place for the team, and then you have to have the right tools in place as well. So, and in addition to that, so it's almost like like I said, it's two parts. You need the right training on these tools for your team, and make sure you have the staffing in place to do all the security testing you need to do at the right time across the SDLC.
Right.
So it's one thing I would say is, the threat landscape is constantly changing for application security.
And expanding.
It's constantly evolving.
Yeah,
Hackers are always looking at different techniques and to kind of exploit vulnerabilities, and newer vulnerabilities are being discovered every day.
Right.
So it's almost like you have to keep pace with all these changes in the industry almost on a weekly, daily basis. Otherwise, you get left out, and you leave your application exposed to a critical vulnerability that your team just didn't know about.
Right.
So training is a huge part of that. That's what would be step one, is to train your team correctly to and make sure that they receive training on a regular basis and they're always up to date. And the second part is that if you don't have the right, it's also hard to find the right security resources. There's only a limited number of security resources, and everyone is competing for those same skill set. So there's a lot of competition out there, and you may just not have enough staff on hand. And in that time, it's best to have like a third-party managed services provider do the security testing for you. And a lot of times that also helps with compliance as well. So if you're in, like, say, the financial industry or the healthcare industry, and you have to meet certain compliance and regulatory requirements, it helps to have a third party do, say, pen testing for you that can look at, hey, say, I need to do PCI compliance pen testing. And the third party is, they've been doing it for years. They have the experienced people on staff. They have a playbook that they've used for PCI pen testing, so they can actually do the testing for you and make sure that you meet your compliance and industry regulations. So it's one, you train your staff consistently, and two is whatever skills that you don't have or the staff that you don't have to augment your own staff, you farm out that to a third-party managed services testing provider.
Okay. Thanks very much. Holistic AppSec, it sounds like an investment very much worth making. Once again, thank you for joining us. This is AppSec Decoded. I'm Taylor Armerding.